Welcome to week two. Today we're going to talk about the varying theoretical perspectives in sociology. And depending on where you look, these might be called different things, right? Sometimes they call them paradigms, the theoretical paradigms or sociological paradigms. The idea is that there's just different ways of looking at the same given phenomenon, right? When I say phenomenon, I'm just saying like things that a thing that happens, right? An occurrence. So there's these social events, these social occurrences that we want to analyze, we want to think about. There's different ways of thinking about them and different ways of approaching them, and we're not valuing one approach over the other, right? We're using each of these approaches to get whatever value we can from that perspective, right? So we want to get a full nuanced understanding of any kind of phenomenon that we observe and that we analyze, and that's what we're after here. We're after a nuanced appreciation of social events and social occurrences, social phenomena. We're looking nuanced understandings, right? Something we want to understand these things in a way where we can really appreciate all the complexity and all the complicated nature of what it is, right? I often say that my students should leave the class with more questions than answers, right? This is not a class, sociology is not a subject where we're going to get to a whole lot of real firm and concrete answers about anything. Maybe there's some, but every kind of answer we get to just kind of leads to more questions. And often the idea behind sociology is to take something that we think we understand and just sort of muddy the waters a little bit. Maybe think the way, what I thought I understood, the way I understood it didn't really take into account all the different things that are involved and all the different things that are going on. And that's going to be a theme. We'll look at different examples of that as we go. But that's going to be a theme for what I talk to you about all semester long, is that if you think it's simple and it deals with people, then you're wrong. People are not simple. People are super complicated. We are complex individuals. We are not just one thing, right? So when you describe someone as being like a singular adjective, immediately that's an inadequate description, right? So anyway, I digress. But we're going to move on. We're going to talk about these different theoretical perspectives as an entry point, as an entryway, as a starting point for understanding things about the human experience in a nuanced way, in a way that allows us to appreciate the complexity of the human experience. So let's get started. So again, depending on where you're looking, these are going to be called different things. Our textbook calls them perspectives. Other textbooks might call them paradigms. But the idea is the same. They're different ways of looking at things. And I kind of like the idea of paradigm, right? Because a paradigm is like a structure. It's like a filing cabinet in your brain, right? So when you gain new information, it just helps you organize that new information that you get, right? So it's just that these perspectives that we're going to talk about. We can consider them analytical tools, right? They're things, they're structures, kind of like scaffolding on a building. It helps us get to different points in our head. It helps us organize the knowledge that we acquire and put it in different places, and just kind of make sense of this new information that we gain. So before we can get started on the theoretical perspectives or paradigms that we're going to talk about today, I want us to quickly review. Remember, we're going to use this term social a lot all semester, so I want to make sure we're real clear on what we're talking about, because we use that term all the time, right? So just know that in a sociology class, when you use the word social, it really carries some pretty significant weight. And it refers to something fairly specific, even though it's broad in its application, right? We can apply it to all sorts of different places, but it means we're just referring to something that has an interactional quality, right? And again, just as an example of how broad this term is, two people don't have to be physically present for something to be social in nature, to have an interactional quality, right? Just like me, I am right at this moment. I am by myself in my office talking to a computer screen, but what I'm doing is definitely being impacted by other people and what other people are expecting and what interactions I hope to generate from this activity. So anyway, social interaction. That's the key link that we want. We also talked about the sociological perspective, and I don't want to overcomplicate it. Again, it's pretty nuanced, but it just means that social forces matter, right? And these social forces are these things that are external. They're not within us. There's something coming in from the outside. You can't see them. You can't touch them. But the expectations and influences of other people and those social structures that we'll talk about in a second, they matter, right? It's just like these social forces, these things that exist within the realm of this interaction that we're looking at. They matter, and they have an effect on what we do, when we do it, how we do it, all those things. Again, social structures are again very nuanced, right? And again, it's kind of tricky to put a specific definition on it because the term is so broad, and it can refer to so many different things. But ideally, we're talking about something that's like just deeply ingrained, something that we don't really necessarily think about. And social structures tend to last. They tend to stick around for a while, and they tend to be very slow to change. So that's what that term static is, as opposed to dynamic, right? Comte, who was our original sociologist, even though he doesn't get to be considered one of the founding fathers of sociology, I don't know who made that decision, but he's pretty important, right? He's the first guy who proposed this idea of social research. So there was a thing that social interaction was something you could study scientifically. So he's really important, but for whatever reason, he kind of gets left out of this sort of trilogy of founding fathers of sociology. But anyway, Comte contrasted social structures with social processes. Social processes are the more dynamic, moving things, and social structures are sort of the static, more stationary things. So you can think of maybe a shopping mall as your social structure. And the social process would be like the act of going to that shopping mall and purchasing and shopping, engaging in commerce, right? Again, that doesn't mean the shopping mall will never change, right? We know that over time these structures can change, but it's going to be much slower, right? And the social process is moving in and around that structure. So that's just one example of social structures and how social processes and social structures affect and are sort of the sort of define the parameters of varying social processes. And then finally, we talked about the sociological imagination, which is where you're relating individual situations to larger social structure. You're connecting the macro to the micro, right? So you're looking at the individual situation and you're exploring how that individual situation is part of a larger pattern. One of the key, and of course that comes from C. Wright Mills, and one of the things C. Wright Mills said that was very, very famously said is that the sociological imagination refers to the intersection of history and biography. So this idea of history is really important to the sociological imagination. We got to go beyond the most obvious observation and really look into the history of the social structure to understand how this came to be. So the sociological imagination goes beyond connecting the micro to the macro, which is really important part of it, but it's also connecting the present to the historical context. And we'll get into tons and tons of examples of that as we go throughout the semester. And speaking of historical context, before we dive into these macro level perspectives, or because we're diving into the macro level perspectives of conflict theory and functionalism, we need to examine the historical context. This quote from Emile Durkheim is a great one, and I think really kind of captures a lot of what C. Wright Mills eventually ended up saying about the sociological imagination, is that in order to understand a given phenomenon, a social fact, social force, whatever it may be, whatever we're trying to understand, understanding the historical context and where it fits in sort of this historical trajectory and timeline is really important. In order to understand conflict theory and functionalism, I think we need to go back to the time period where those ideas were born. So the French Revolution, the book mentioned, was a time of great social upheaval, and both Durkheim and Marx were born shortly after the French Revolution, or the tail end of it. And so they came of age in Europe during the Industrial Revolution, and that had a huge impact on the way they saw the world. So let's take a minute to explore the Industrial Revolution and figure out what exactly we're talking about there. So the Industrial Revolution is kind of characterized by the rise of the factory, of manufactured goods, right? It's just this time where technology advanced. We developed the technology to have machines that would make most of the things that we needed, right? Prior to the Industrial Revolution, we were looking at more of an agrarian society, right? Agriculture based. And so kind of like everybody in these communities, everybody got together in communities and kind of everybody did everything. You made your own clothes, you made your own food, you built your own shelter. Everybody just kind of did everything. All the little things that you needed to do to survive everybody took part in that. With the Industrial Revolution came this specialization of labor, where instead of everybody kind of contributing and doing all the little things that you needed to do to sustain life, you could move to the city and you could get one job and do that one job and make money, right? So the idea of standardized currency was really crucial to this. But you would go into the city, you would do that one job, you would make money, and then you would use that money to buy all the other things that you needed. So it was a time of huge social change. Everything was changing. So let's look and just I got some pictures to look at. So this is what kind of an industrial factory looks like. And again, notice how many people are sort of being crammed into these. This is the rise of the assembly line, right? You're doing these like kind of small menial tasks for hours and hours on end. So it's sort of an oppressive workflow. But it became sort of the dominant mode, and there were some reasons for this. Like, right, if you look at a history textbook on the Industrial Revolution, they're going to talk about things like the Irish potato famine, right? So there was, the Black Plague. Anyway, there were all sorts of reasons where just in certain episodes, in certain situations, agricultural life and the viability of agriculture began to suffer, and that prompted a lot of farms to die, and the people who owned those farms then moved to the cities where they could get these jobs at these factories. So there were a couple of key historical events that helped precipitate this change, but the end result was urban migration, right, where everybody was moving to the city to get the jobs to work in these factories. Now there are some things like child labor that came up, and these machines and the industrial 19th century industrial machines had really small parts, right? So children were sought after laborers because they had tiny little fingers that could get in and repair the small parts that could break down in these machines. So child labor was a problem. Pollution became a big problem in these cities. Again, coal fueled the Industrial Revolution, and back then, coal burned real dirty. Coal still burns pretty dirty, but there are other refining processes that we've done to make it burn a little bit cleaner. But I mean, back then, I mean, just look at those smokestacks and all of the nasty, the soot that was just covering these cities. And it was bad. It prompted, it precipitated disease, and just an overall poor kind of standard of living and standard of health. And then there was also problems of infrastructure, right? You had all these people that were living. This was the rise of the tenement house. So this is what we kind of now think of as like apartments, where you're kind of cramming a lot of dwellings into one small space. We've sort of figured out how to do that now, but when they were first doing it, there were things they didn't anticipate, like having modern plumbing. So here's an example of like a bathroom in one of the tenement houses. one of what used to be a tenement house. And you can see that it's just like little holes that go straight to the ground, right? There's no like modern system of plumbing to properly and safely and sanitarily dispose of your pee and your poop. So your pee and your poop is just going under the ground, and every time it rains a little bit, the streets are literally flooded with pee and poop. It's gross. It was not a fun place to live. Not to mention trash, right? They didn't have trash pickup, right? No like uniform dump sites, right? So again, along with the pee and the poop, all of your trash, which you're producing at record paces, right? You're producing more trash than you ever did before with the rise of the factory. Now all that trash is getting mixed in with the pee and the poop, and again, the industrial city around the tenement houses were just awful places to live. So they presented problems, and the problems were rooted in this sort of mass microcosm of human interaction, and that is where sociology sort of became useful. Studying these problems and figuring out solutions to these problems of interaction became a viable science. Now, before we jump into the specifics of functionalism, Durkheimian functionalism, right? Durkheim as the sort of the founding father of functionalism, Marx as the founding father of conflict theory. Before we jump into those differing theories, let's talk about what sort of was the key issue that sort of separated their philosophies, right? Because they're both observing the same thing. They're both seeing deteriorating conditions in the cities during the Industrial Revolution, and they're seeing some problems, right? Some very real, obvious problems with how people were living in the cities. But the conclusions they drew from those observations were pretty different. And so I think it's prudent now to look at the key difference, which is the philosophy, their philosophy on human nature, really kind of what makes us human, right? That's the key question, is what makes humans different from the rest of the animal kingdom? For Durkheim, it was the idea that we live in society in general, right? For Marx, it was his term was creative capacity. It was the fact that humans are the only animal that seek to sort of dominate their environment as opposed to just sort of adapt to the environment, right? We build structures, and as far back in human history as we can record, we've done things to manipulate our environment to make it livable, right? So that was Marx's key, right? For Marx, it was creative capacity. That's what makes us human. Durkheim, what makes us human is the fact that we live in a society. So based on that, it might seem counterintuitive, but Durkheim was actually more of the pessimistic one, while Marx was more optimistic regarding human nature. Durkheim thought that left on our own, people were awful. We would just kind of revert back to those base animal instincts, and we would kill and murder, and we would just take what we needed when we needed it, with no sense of morality, right? Marx, on the other hand, thought that people left on their own were basically decent, right? That we didn't necessarily need social norms and social structures to sort of guide our decency or morality, that we were basically good all on our own. So that gets into their different takes on the different functions that they saw for social structures. For Durkheim, social structures were the source of morality, right? The idea that we live in a collective, that we live among other people, and that we have some sense of shared values with the people around us. That is what keeps us sort of in line, right? Durkheim did a lot of writing on deviance, right? And again, he's a functionalist, right? So that means that everything works to serve some sort of function, right? It's all part of the greater whole. Deviant and criminal activity for Durkheim was an important function because it delineated the boundaries of acceptable behavior. So even things like murder and theft were actually important because they helped us define where we draw the line in acceptable behavior. Until someone stepped out and killed somebody for a piece of bread, we didn't know exactly how people would react to that. And when it happened, it shocked us. It was a shocking thing. So people said, yeah, murder is bad, right? We can all agree that murder is bad. So for Durkheim, those social structures are what give us that morality. His seminal work was Suicide, or one of his seminal work. I mean, Durkheim was all over the place, man. But one of the key works that always is important to understanding the nature of sociology and what we're studying is his work on suicide, where he took macro level data. He just pulled information about who commits suicide. So previously, suicide was dealt with solely by psychologists, right? It was sort of like what happened for that one person, and why did that one person choose to take their own life? But Durkheim pulled it back and looked at patterns, right? This is the key thing. Where really one of the key moments in the life of sociology that Durkheim looked for patterns in who and under what circumstances people committed suicide, and he found that Protestants tended to commit suicide at higher rates than Catholics, and he blamed it on Protestant individualism, right? The Catholics tend to live more in a collective, and so they have this greater sense of belonging to one another, whereas Protestants championed the idea of individualism more, and that you were solely responsible for your own survival and that kind of thing. So suicide was sort of a byproduct of this, or in large part, not solely, right? Again, it's all complex. There's no one thing, but that Protestant individualism has a deteriorating effect on society because it produces what we call anomie, or this sort of lack of collectivity, the lack of belonging, a sense that you are all on your own and that you're not part of this collective group, right? So that's Durkheim, right? For Durkheim, we need to live in a society. We need to live around people, and we derive morality and our sense of duty and obligation from the people around us. Marx, on the other hand, saw social structures as totally different. Or not totally different, but he saw social structures as being tools of oppression. That social structures were, by their very nature, they were tools that were used to exploit the weak people in favor of the powerful. So for Durkheim, it always goes back to the economy, right? And again, he's operating in the Industrial Revolution and the rise of the manufacturing economy. So he saw as this sort of society as having basically two classes drawn along economic lines: those who controlled the means of production, right? The manufacturing industry, who owned the factories and the machineries that were used to produce goods, and then the workers, the people who worked in those factories and operated those machines. And for Marx, what he saw was that there was necessarily a squeeze that was going to have to be put on the weaker folks, so that there's the nature of capitalism, and competition within capitalism meant that the owners were going to have to continually squeeze more production for less money, right? Less compensation, and less investment in the people, right? So again, it's kind of weird that this comes from these two different takes on society. For Durkheim, it comes from a pessimistic place, but it ends in a sort of optimistic place where we have to live in this collective society, and that is going to on its own. If we just let society do its thing, it's going to produce this sense of collective conscience and this sense of shared morality. Marx says, left on its own in the capitalist system, in the capitalist economy, in this function, left on its own, the wealthy are going to crush the weak, basically, right? But so it's just kind of interesting that while Durkheim starts from a place of pessimism about human nature, he comes to this sort of optimistic view on the world, whereas Marx starts with this optimistic view about human nature and comes to the conclusion that it is the social structures that are oppressing that basically decent human nature. So to review Durkheim, and functionalism is based on this sense of solidarity. And you can see the quote again. This feels like a very optimistic thing, right? We need to live in a society. We need to live among other people, and that is where we will derive our sense of morality. And so, as long as we keep living in this sort of, as long as we keep living together and feeling this duty toward each other, society will sort of self-correct, and that the problems that arise, we will develop institutions to address those problems. And so, to the case in point is that over time we did develop things like public infrastructure and plumbing systems and trash collection and labor laws that protected children from harsh working conditions, right? So for Durkheim, the thing that we had to avoid was this sense of enemy, right? And that is that French word for chaos, right? That we are all on our own. If we get this sense that we're not living in a society and that we're not living within this sense of within this collective conscience, that we don't feel like we're a part of that society, if we don't feel like we're a part of the collective, then that's where things are really going to present problems. So the idea was that really we need some control. We need social structures to help control people and to keep us all invested in this thing that we call society. So that's the root of functionalism, right? That we need to live in this collective society to develop a collective conscience, and then that society, as long as we keep living as a collective and as long as we keep living together and working together, that as long as we stay in society, that society will self-correct and will generate those institutions that will address the social problems that will continually arise. So that's the roots of functionalism. Now let's get to the roots of conflict theory. So conflict theory is rooted in the idea of class conflict, right? And now there have been iterations of conflict theory that have persisted through the generations that take as the point of conflict different things, gender conflict and racial conflict, things like that. But originally, conflict theory was very much an economic thing, right? And because for Marx, the main driver of class distinctions was the economy, was your role in the means of production within this manufacturing economy. So now, before we get too far into this, we have to make clear a key difference between Durkheimian collective conscience and what Marx would call class consciousness. So the difference between conscience and conscious, because they sound really similar, but they're pretty different, right? So conscience is the idea of morality, right? You have a conscience, and while conscious is just awareness, right? Think about someone being knocked unconscious, right? You just become, you're not aware anymore. You're not with it. So consciousness is just sort of awareness, being aware of your surroundings, aware of what's going on around you. Conscience, right, is this sense of morality. So with that out of the way, usually words that look so close, like, have similar meanings, but these are very different meanings. So I don't even know the etymology. We won't get into it. Class conflict for Marx was the defining factor of society, right? And that social systems were designed along economic lines to allow the rich to exploit the poor. In this model, in the Marxist perspective, the rich people are definitely the bad guys, but it's not their fault, right? It's always, for Marx, it was always capitalism. Capitalism is the boogeyman, right? The sin is in the structure. And I put quotes around that because those aren't my words, but they're also not Marx's words. That comes from something different, but a movement inspired by Marx later on called liberation theology, and I don't want to get into that. But anyway, the idea is that it's not like there are oppressors, and the rich folks and the owners, the bourgeoisie, they are the oppressors. But the way that they're doing the oppressing, the thing that is actually making the oppression happen, is the system itself, right? The owners, because of the nature of capitalism, they don't have a choice in the matter. Because of the nature of competition, they have to squeeze as much value as they can for as little investment as possible, and that inevitably results in a squeeze on the working class, right? They will do whatever they can to micromanage their time and to reduce working conditions, as long as it helps the bottom line, the humanity of the workers, of the proletariat. That's not what matters. What matters is increasing the wealth, right? And so very much, and it's hard to blame Marx for seeing this, right? I mean, you have those miserable conditions in the cities in the Industrial Revolution and as in the 19th century. It was a miserable place to live. People were getting their limbs lopped off in industrial accidents. They were dying in industrial accidents. They were getting sick. They were ingesting all sorts of contaminants and getting sick and dying really early in life. It was just a miserable way to live. While just right up the street were the owners in their elegant mansions. That contrast, made you think. It seems natural that someone would say, well, wait a minute. At some point, all the folks, because the people living in the squalid conditions in the city vastly outnumber the people living in the mansions. At some point, they're going to get mad. The poor folks are going to get mad, and bad things are going to happen. So we can sort of understand where Marx is coming from when he makes these observations. So, but let me get into the caveat here that I have to do, my little disclaimer on Marx, right? Even today, sociologists, economists, historians find a lot of value in Marx's observations and the way in what he observed about how a system can produce exploitation, right? Again, it's not about the evil people doing evil things. It's about a system that makes this evil possible, that makes the bad things happen, right? And so, again, the sin is not in the individual actions. It's in the structure that necessitates those actions, right? So there's a lot of value in that perspective, in the conflict theory perspective, and those are born out of the Marx's observations, right? Now, Marx's prescriptions, what he proposed to do about those problems, they were all bad. History has borne out that, these were bad ideas, right? So this isn't a defense of Marx as a political theorist, because he and the communists from the Soviet Union, from what became the Soviet Union, the Lenins and the what's his name, Stalin, Mao Zedong in China, like these are bad people in history. Like these are not the good guys of the 20th century. They are bad guys, and they were all informed by Marxist theories. So, and more importantly, they were really informed by Marx's prescriptions, by taking to heart what Marx said you should do about this, which was seize the means of production and violently overthrow the economic structure. So I mean, we can. I would love to take the time to actually really get into the history of the 20th century and how Marx's prescriptions and how the Communist Manifesto was brought to reality within political structures. But that's really more of a political science and history debate or discussion. It's not a debate. Discussion is the word I'm looking for. But that's beyond our purview. What we want to take away from our discussion of Marx is this concept of exploitation and the idea that a system itself can be exploitative. And if you go on to take social problems, you'll see it all the time. That's one of the key paradigms in sociology is the fact that we're not necessarily looking for bad people doing bad things. We're looking at problems within a structure, within a system. So, and those ideas have a direct link to Marx's ideas of how the capitalist system is exploitative. Again, that doesn't mean that everybody talking about systemic social problems are Marxists. Just that they are operating in a tradition that was sort of begun on the ideas of Marx. But again, to separate out the political, the economic, and the social theories that all were derived from Karl Marx is way beyond our purview. I just want to, just want to make sure I'm going on record as saying Marx, Lenin, Stalin, Mao, these are bad people. They're bad. They are villains of history in the way their ideas were manifested in reality. All right, there, I said it. All right, so our video has already gone over 30 minutes, and I like to try to keep these in like 30-minute chunks. So I'm going to put a pause on this one, and we will do symbolic interactionism in a separate video, because I think it may be the one that's most difficult to understand as a micro level theory, and the words themselves. Symbolic interactionism is probably the one that kind of sounds the most the one that's the most intimidating when you just look at the words on a page. So we'll try to break that down and demystify it in the next video. So take a look at that one. And the question at the end asks you to give a little bit of feedback to me as I make these videos. If you got any advice, I will definitely at certain points I'll incorporate videos from like YouTube, and there's something called Crash Course Sociology. I'll bring those in so it's less just me talking. So I will try to switch it up so it won't just be me lecturing to a blank computer screen every time. So anyway, whatever. I encourage some feedback. Let me know how you think this material could be delivered better, or if any of it is going well, or if you think it's right, let me know. But yeah, I'm looking for suggestions on how to make some content a little bit more engaging. If you have any ideas, I'm open to them. So anyway, that's what I got for you today. Again, there's another video below this one by the time you're seeing it. So check that one out as well. Thank you all.